So I'm going to be speaking about sort of two topics. There's sort of two parts to my deck. I'm going to go quite fast. So I'm going to talk a little bit about energy system and transition, but then I'm also going to talk about some tools we use to estimate the costs of power interruptions. And from there, you can actually estimate the value of making investments in the power system, or if you're a commercial building owner, investments, in your facility to mitigate the impacts of power interruptions. So we hear a lot in the news about the energy system being in transition. And so I really wanted to set some context about what that actually means. And instead of, kind of esoterically talking about what energy transition is, I'm going to give you an example from my home state. I actually live in Montana. And the things that are happening in Montana are quite consistent with what we're seeing across the country. So I'm going to rattle off all these graphics that just show you what's happening in Montana as a proxy for what's happening in many other parts of the country. And so when you look at these graphics and think about what they mean, realize that this kind of thing is happening in other places. So in some ways, Montana is a very unique place, of course, but in some ways, what's happening here is very similar to what many of you probably are seeing in your homes as well. So looking at Montana, we're just going to start with sales and peak demand. And this is sort of sales of electricity. And so on the left-hand graphic, you can see all the different customer classes, residential, commercial, and industrial customers. With the exception of commercial in Montana, industrial and residential customer sales in terms of electricity are increasing over time, and they're expected to increase over the future. So that's an interesting fact. Peak demand, this is kind of the highest amount of demand at some point in time, is also increasing for across both the summer and winter periods. So not only do we have sales of electricity increasing, the peak, the amount of demand that customers are seeking at some point in time is also increasing both in the summer and the winter. In terms of Montana, GDP, gross domestic product, and population have been increasing. I know this isn't always the case in every state, but I think it's a pretty good bet that most states are seeing similar growth in both GDP and population. Not surprisingly, like other parts of the country, electric vehicle, the amount of registered electric vehicles is growing quite rapidly. I would say it's probably growing at maybe a slower pace in terms of volume than other states, just because we're a cold climate. We don't have as many charging facilities, but it's a pretty staggering increase, and this is happening across the country as well. And that has implications for the consumption and demand for electricity. Not surprisingly, like other parts of the country, customers are installing more renewable energy. So both commercial and industrial customers here in Montana are, putting in solar panels, for example, solar plus batteries at their commercial building or, at their home. So we see growth here as well in that space. Energy efficiency in Montana is a little bit more of a nuanced story. Commercial customers, there has been growth in energy efficiency program savings. But with the residential and the industrial customers, it's a little bit more of a kind of a mixed bag in terms of whether there's actually been growth in program savings. But in general, there's been a lot of activity in energy efficiency programs over the last several decades. And it's a little bit of a mixed bag in Montana, but in some sectors, for example, the commercial sector, we are seeing some growth in program savings from energy efficiency. In terms of, peak savings, these are sort of savings that occur when peak demand occurs, maybe 4 to 6 p.m. in the afternoon. We are seeing just in the last, I would say, 8 to 10 years, an increase in demand response potential here in Montana. But if you look at that dash line up on the top, we're well below the national average. So These demand response programs are increasing in Montana, but we're below the national average. In terms of the supply side, generation, electricity generated by Montana's power plants is actually decreasing over time. You can see that on the left. You see a reduction in coal, generation from coal. We have coal-fired power plants here in Montana, one big one named Colstrip. And so you can see a reduction. Some of the other sectors, though, or the other types of generation sources are seeing an increase, and that includes wind, a little bit of solar. Hydroelectric is more or less constant. The big reduction in generation capacity and the amount of megawatt hours generated is due to the Colstrip power plant essentially producing less, and we're seeing some retirements there. One of the really interesting elements of the energy transition is that some of these resources, these generation resources, provide very little supply during times of peak demand. And that's important because, customers are demanding power when it's really cold out or when it's really hot out. What types of power plants actually produce electricity during those times of day? And it turns out that some of our more base load generation, this would be the coal-fired power plants, the hydro, and to some extent the natural gas plants, provide that power. That's not to say that wind and solar don't provide power during peak. It's just more difficult to forecast if those types of resources will be available when customers demand electricity the most. So that's something to be keeping in mind in your own regions is, during those times of peak demand, it's usually in the late afternoon when people get home from work. Who's providing the power? And it turns out that some of the fossil fuel generation sources typically provide, and some hydroelectric provide that power here in Montana. That's not to say, again, that solar and wind don't produce power during peak. It's just a little bit more intermittent given the sort of the natural element of those types of resources. We don't, during those times, we don't know if the sun's always going to shine or the wind is always going to blow. One of the big issues here in Montana, and I think this is pretty consistent with other parts of the country, is that the utilities are identifying a need. They need to build more generation, whether it's renewables, fossil-fired generation, hydro, things like that. But it's really unclear when these resources might be built. And so when you look at the investor-owned utilities in Montana, there are really just two, Northwestern and Montana Dakota Power, the Montana Dakota Utilities. They've identified some resources, but they have unknown dates when these resources may come available. And so as you can see, there's an unknown date of when battery storage or a natural gas plant might be available in Montana. And that creates challenges for planners, both at the utility, but also transmission planners who need to build transmission to get the power from these unknown resources somewhere within our state. Independent power producers, so these are organizations or institutions that build power plants and sell power to utilities and cooperatives and other types of customers, are proposing a significant amount of new capacity. But when we look at whether this capacity actually materializes, we find that a lot of this capacity is actually withdrawn from the planning stage. And so you can see that kind of over in the right columns in my table here. 91% of the wind that's been proposed by independent power producers in Montana was withdrawn. In region-wide, so this is essentially the Pacific Northwest, it's closer to 94%. And so you start to see some really interesting things when we have utilities indicating they have a need for new generation. We have independent power producers saying they'd like to build new generation, and then they're withdrawing their proposals. Like I said a second ago, this is a pretty consistent story that you see in other parts of the country. Over 7,000 megawatts of the region, this region where I live, the coal-fired generation could retire within the next 2 decades. And that has profound impacts for how do you meet demand? If you have a lot of coal-fired power plants retiring, and you're seeing independent power producers withdraw their proposals for new solar or wind or natural gas units, for example, and you're not seeing a lot of new transmission capacity being built, then you start to see a situation materialize where we may have some challenges down the road. Like other states, Montana has benefited from being an exporter of electricity for a long time, and they are trending, or we are trending, to being a net importer of electricity. And that has implications for the market. Where do you get that power that you're trying to import? And can you get it to Montana if you don't have transmission being built, like what is happening in a lot of other parts of the country where we don't have the transmission being built that needs to be built to meet demand? We also looked at whether transmission pathways serving Montana are showing signs of being congested. That means that the lines that serve Montana, the big power lines you see when you're driving on the highway, are they congested? Is there a lot of power moving through those lines? And if the lines are loaded too heavily, you can't get the power you need at the time when you need it. And so the major transmission lines serving Montana, many of them are reporting congestion, and that's a challenge because there's not a lot of new transmission being built. Having said that, there was a recent announcement with Northwestern Energy and some partners that they would like to build a major transmission line connecting Montana to the Eastern interconnection. So power could move from Montana east and power from the east could move to Montana. So that's an interesting and exciting development. But in general, the lines that we have today are congested, and that's a challenge. And this is, a finding that you'll see in other parts of the country as well. It's not just unique to Montana. As I've kind of alluded to multiple times already, there's a lot of discussion about new transmission. But these new transmission lines face a lot of hurdles. There's regulatory permitting and environmental review, a lot of jurisdictional issues that happen when you try to develop transmission lines that connect states. And so there's a lot of transmission being planned. Now, whether this will be materialized in the future is an open question. And so there's concern, even the proposed amount of new transmission lines, if they're built, may not keep pace with the load growth that I showed on the first slide, that growing sales, growing peak demand. And so there's a lot of planned transmission. Even if it materialized, there are concerns that there's not enough to deal with the load growth we're seeing all over the country from data centers and electric vehicles and electrification. So these are challenges to be aware of. Of course, the power system doesn't operate in a vacuum. There are a number of threats that the power system faces. And I'm just going to focus on a few threats here in the Pacific Northwest. Many of these threats are applicable to other parts of the country. So we're seeing persistent drought conditions in parts of the Northwest, particularly in Oregon, parts of Washington, Wyoming. If you have droughts, the hydroelectric resources can't necessarily produce as much power as they were designed to when there was high hydraulic conditions. So something to be aware of, because what happens in the Northwest affects the rest of the country, especially the Western US. If those hydro resources, which are major generation sources, are not able to deliver power across the Northwest, then the problems start to amplify in places like California, Nevada, and other places in the West, and has implications for the East as well. We're certainly seeing a lot of information about the frequency and intensity of wildfires. Obviously, California is in the news today with a pretty catastrophic wildfire materializing in LA. If you have wildfires, you have the potential to damage transmission and distribution lines and generation resources as well. And so if you have that type of situation, then you can't even deliver power. Not only are you worried about loss of life and property, but you're also worried about not getting power to where it needs to be if you have lines that have been damaged due to wildfire or smoke. Back on this one, if you're in the East, issues like hurricanes, ice storms, earthquakes, particularly in the West and parts of the Midwest. These are also threats that obviously are of great interest to the utility industry. Cyber and physical attacks on grid infrastructure. This is, obviously a growing concern. Everything is interconnected. The utility system has communications, two-way communications between customers and the utility. There are concerns about the increased risk from cyber and physical attacks, and there's been a bunch of news about this in recent memory. And so this is an emerging threat that folks in the utility sector are really keeping a close eye on. And then, as I mentioned, when you have all of these things happening, the growing supply, the growing sales and demand of electricity, you have resources, generation resources that are intermittent, like wind and solar, and you have fossil-fired resources that are being retired, and you have transmission lines that are that have congestion, and you're not having enough transmission lines being built, and then you add in these threats, then you start to see some real big challenges across regional markets. And so this is from the graphic on the right is from the FERC, or actually the NERC annual reliability risk report. There was a new one that was just came out within the last week. Very similar story. We have some real risk of electricity shortages occurring across regional markets. And I would urge you to, think about the fact that what happens in the West doesn't just stay in the West. It can impact the East as well. So if you're in a situation where regional markets are really stressed, there's supply is retiring, load is growing, or sales are growing, and all these threats, then you have regional markets and the prices start to show spikes in terms of electricity. And so here's an example. If a utility is trying to purchase power from the open market and somehow get it into their service territory, you see these price spikes. And this is really interesting. This one on the left, this is the Midwest ISO, Montana Dakota Utility. So this is up in this little price hub is up in my neck of the woods. But you see this spike with Winter Storm Uri. If anyone on the call is from Texas, you'll know what that was. That was a winter storm that occurred in Texas. And guess what? It spiked prices in North Dakota and Montana. So what happens in Texas impacts other parts of the country. Similarly, if we look at the Mid-Columbia wholesale market, this is where power is purchased on a marketplace called Mid-Columbia. This is kind of the Pacific Northwest. You have heat waves and different events that are spiking the price. And what happens is utilities have to purchase this power at 5 to 10 times the normal cost that would take to produce in their own service territory. So this gets passed along to the customers. If you're a residential or a commercial or industrial customers, this gets passed along to you eventually. So that's something to be aware of, that these regional markets are being impacted by these events. And what happens if you're not able to produce or deliver electricity? Well, I think everybody knows what happens. We have power interruptions. And so in Montana, we're able to put a cost on that. We're actually able to put a cost on that across the country. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But in Montana, the costs of power interruptions have been growing over time, between $200 and $500 million a year. These are costs to customers from power interruptions. They're increasing over time. And you can see the small commercial and industrial customers, that's where most of the costs are occurring. So something to be aware of when you have this sort of collision of things happening to the power sector, and then you have the increased probability that there may be a power interruption, that has implications for customers, including residential, commercial, and industrial customers, and public sector customers as well. So now I'm going to talk about some of the work we do valuing reliability and resilience. And so Berkeley Lab, we do a lot of work in this space. This graphic kind of captures all the things we do. We spend a lot of time estimating the cost of power interruptions. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Once you do that, then you can start to understand what's the value proposition if you make an investment in a building. If you make an investment in the power system to mitigate the risk of power interruptions, now you can put a value on it. It's an avoided cost of not having a power interruption or mitigating a power interruption. And you can start to look at different technologies and strategies and see which ones have the highest benefit to cost ratio. So we have two tools that we're working on here at Berkeley Lab that estimate the costs of power interruptions. One is called the Interruption Cost Estimate Calculator, and the other one is called the Power Outage Economics Tool. The ICE calculator focuses on short duration power interruptions, those that last out to 24 hours in duration. The POET tool focuses on the bigger economic impacts when you have multi-day widespread power interruptions, like you saw in Texas. You have to use two different tools because there are two different sets of issues that materialize when you have these long duration power interruptions. So Power Outage Economics Tool is a project that's got a bunch of different partners: Berkeley Lab, Boston University, USC, and then Resource Innovations. And what it is it's a hybrid valuation approach. We use a combination of survey data, surveys of customers, commercial, industrial, residential customers, and we take those survey responses and we run them through a regional economic model. We essentially trick the model into believing that there's no power in the economy for 3 days or a week or 2 weeks or a month. And we see what the economic impacts of those power interruptions are. And so we partnered up with Commonwealth Edison, which is a big utility in Greater Chicago, to pilot this POET approach. And we're able to estimate changes in gross output. That's basically industry revenue. So if you're a commercial building owner, we can estimate for your sector of the economy, what's the lost revenue because there was a 14-day power interruption. We can also look at changes in gross domestic product, as well as household consumption. And we looked at 15 different microregions across Commonwealth Edison and 38 industrial sectors. So we shock the model and we look at how all the different sectors of the economy and different regions across Illinois and actually beyond are impacted by that power interruption. I'm not going to get into the results. You can find our report. I'd be happy to share it here later. But basically, we developed a little interface for Commonwealth Edison. They can pick some assumptions. How long is a power outage, and what sectors they care about, and it basically spits out a bunch of results showing what the economic impact of power interruptions are on all these different sectors of the economy and regions across Commonwealth Edison service territory. So this is a really innovative tool. We're excited. We're going to be hopefully releasing a national version here in the next couple of years. The ICE calculator is our bread and butter tool. It's been around for a long time now. It estimates the cost of shorter duration power interruptions. It's used to justify many billions of dollars of investments across the utility space. It was originally developed with funding from the Department of Energy. Basically, you go into the tool and you say, how long are power outages, how frequent are power outages in a particular state, and it calculates the costs for all the different customer classes. Utilities use it all the time in front of regulators. They say, we're going to make an investment in undergrounding our power system. And because we did that, we avoided $2.3 billion in costs of power interruption. So this tool is very widely used. It's based on survey data that was collected, in some cases, a long time ago. And we didn't have survey data from across the country. And so we got support from the Department of Energy to update the ICE calculator with direct funding from sponsoring US utilities. So we have a lot of utilities who've joined a major effort to update this tool because it's being used across the country. And so this is a list of some of the sponsoring utilities that are funding Berkeley Lab and our partners to survey their customers and estimate the costs of power interruptions. We have additional partners in the works. We also have a partnership with the Rural Electric Co-op Association, NRECA. So we're surveying rural co-op customers as well to understand what are the costs of short duration power interruptions. We're going to be releasing ICE Calculator 2.0 here in the next couple of weeks, and we'll continue updating it as we get more and more survey data in. But we're really excited. It's a major project that's been underway for a few years now. This is the type of information the ICE Calculator generates. This is fairly crude. The ICE Calculator website is going to be completely overhauled. It's going to look very modern. You basically enter how long is a power interruption, how frequent are my power interruptions, and it'll spit out costs for different customer classes by location. So this is the residential customers. If you have a momentary power interruption, something 5 minutes or less, it's roughly a $2 cost to those customers. If you have a 24-hour power interruption, the rough cost is about $53. Again, this is just generalized numbers just to show you what this tool, the type of information this tool generates. When you look at non-residential customers, this is where you see the results start to amplify. So a momentary power interruption for a typical non-residential customer, it's about $1,000. But when you get out to 24 hours, a typical non-residential customer, you're seeing tens of thousands of dollars of costs. And that's why the costs are dominated by commercial and industrial customers. So the energy system is in a state of transition due to increasing demand for electricity, just like I showed you for Montana. We have data centers coming online, electrification, a lot of different things happening there. The transmission system is congested and there are bottlenecks to building new transmission. This has been a challenge for a number of years now. We have more reliance on intermittent generation resources. Wind and solar are great. They're environmentally friendly for the most part, but they don't always produce power when the system needs it. And that's a challenge for power system planners and operations staff. There are a lot of retirements of fossil-fired generation. And then there are supply chain vulnerabilities. We didn't talk about that today, but if you need parts for that wind turbine, the blades, or you need a turbine component for a natural gas plant, we are seeing some supply chain vulnerabilities, especially in an environment where there may be tariffs in the future. And then, of course, the sort of the gorilla in the room is we have increased frequency and magnitude of both man-made, but also natural hazards. And that is sort of encompasses the entire power and energy system. So what are some selected strategies that, different customer classes can do to mitigate risks associated with power disruptions? Because this collision of events that I list on the left may lead to the increased frequency and duration of power interruptions in the future for customers. All customers, if they have the resources, could purchase backup generators and test them. It's not just, you can't just buy a generator and expect it to work. You also have to test it and make sure it will work when you need it. Continuing to invest in energy efficiency is obviously a no-brainer. It reduces stress on the power system if more facilities, residential, commercial, industrial, have energy efficient appliances, lighting, and so forth. Installing solar plus battery storage is a mitigation strategy. If your building has solar plus storage, you may be able to ride out some power interruptions. Is this inexpensive? Not necessarily. But if you really are looking for reliable power, you're not relying on the transmission or distribution lines that are sending electricity to your facility, solar plus storage may be an option to consider. Developing contingency plans for when the power goes out. This is just a no-brainer, whether you're a household or a business. You should be thinking about what you could do in the event that you don't have power. The next one is really important, just participating in discussions about the future of the power system, whether it's attending rate proceedings with the utility or getting involved with an NGO or working with your neighborhood to understand how you can prepare yourself. These are things that proactive customers can do, and they should be doing in the event that we see more frequent and longer lasting power interruptions. Participation in demand response programs is also important because it reduces load during the peak. And the peak is typically where we see some of the biggest impacts of power interruptions. If you have a heat wave, the power gets shut off. If there's more demand response in the system, the power system may be more stable. And so this is not only a benefit to customers because they get some bill savings for participating in these programs, it's also a benefit to the system. And then for the public sector and businesses in particular, really ensuring that critical infrastructure has reliable and resilient power. Hospitals, nursing homes, wastewater treatment facilities, first responders, these types of facilities, you just need to make sure that they are set up to ride out a power interruption if it occurs, because you can have catastrophic loss of life if those types of infrastructure do not have power. And so with that, I'm done. I'm happy to take some questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Pete. Very interesting presentation, and I think people are sort of typically not exposed to sort of this perspective and on the grid side. I have a question, and then we have a couple of questions in the chat to go over, and people can maybe also sort of raise their hands and ask them. Well, from my perspective, being a building person, I always find interesting the new kind of trend about demand flexibility and how that is often not it's often thought of kind of building by building, but there's not really any way of evaluating the impact on the distribution system. And I was wondering if there's research at the labs or other places to start thinking about demand flexibility, not just kind of from the demand side, but also the impact on not transmission, but definitely distribution.
Yeah, so I'll say that I'm not an expert in demand flexibility, but what I can tell you is the lab, Berkeley Lab, and other labs for that matter, have expertise in demand flexibility. And I think, Marco, you can probably connect folks with those people. But one thing I will say is that if someone can demonstrate that having, a group of buildings that have demand flexibility and that reduces the stress on the distribution system. And what I mean by stress is it reduces the potential for a power disruption or reduces the duration of power interruption, either for the feeder that's serving those facilities or for the broader system, the power system. If that impact can be demonstrated, then we have tools available to estimate the benefit of doing that. So we can estimate what the cost of power interruptions are before there are demand flexible buildings and after. And the difference between those two is the avoided economic impact, either to the neighborhood or the system. So those, we can connect the dots if it can be demonstrated that demand flexibility in facilities reduces either the frequency or duration of power interruptions.
Okay, thank you. I see several questions here. Let's start from Larry is asking why so many projects were withdrawn in Montana.
Yeah, so let's go back to that slide. I'll speak more general than just Montana, but let's get it back. Here we go. This slide. A lot of it has to do with the unavailability of transmission. And this Berkeley lab, my department in particular, has been doing pioneering work on what we call the interconnection queues. So when utilities or independent power producers are suggesting building new resources like wind or solar or natural gas, they go into what's called an interconnection queue. It's a line to connect to the transmission system. And we maintain databases across the country showing these interconnection queues. And one of the things we find is that, the potential of not having that transmission available so that they can actually connect is causing these generation sources to be withdrawn. So I would say there are a lot of factors. It could be, the company doesn't have the finances in place. It could be some of the permitting issues, but I think the big sort of national concern is there's not enough transmission available or planned in the future to accommodate this new generation that's being proposed.
Thank you. There's another question with Robert asking about sort of generation, which I think is related to this. And I think another one here is talking about energy efficiency program. And if you are you folks making any recommendation to utilities uh, for design of microgrids and other solutions for remote communities?
Yeah,
Yeah, go
there are a
ahead.
number of yeah, there are a number of researchers at Berkeley Lab who do look at kind of the design, the optimal design of microgrids. We've written a case study recently on sort of a microgrid that was implemented in Southern California and how it really improved the reliability of the power system. Um, I'm not sure how much we are directly advising regulators on the design of microgrids, but I know of colleagues like Miguel Heleno who have been working with, utilities to develop tools to help with the decision around implementing microgrids. Like, what are the costs? What are the benefits if you actually install a microgrid in a certain location? So we have tools and we have resources that study that issue, but I'm not an expert on microgrids, unfortunately.
Thanks, Pete. And another question here is sort of uh, if transmission is the problem, why are utilities incentivizing more DERs and kind of, I guess there's a sense that utilities are not super happy about DERs in distributed energy resources, and they may have additional concerns. So can you speak a little bit about kind of centralized versus distributed
Yeah.
generation?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the utility business model for the last 100+ years is it's sort of a hub and spoke system where you have a big central power plant that delivers electricity through the transmission system, down to the distribution system, into your home or business. If you have a bunch of distributed resources like neighborhoods that are all solar, um, that's kind of flips the business model for the utility. Um, they have that, what that can lead to is if you have all these customers with distributed resources, yes, those customers may have more reliable and resilient power in some cases, but the utilities and the customers, by extension, made an investment in the transmission system and the generation system. And because you may not be using that transmission system as much, how do you cover the costs? These are called stranded assets or stranded costs. And so there are utilities that are exploring different business models where, for example, they lease distributed energy systems to customers. So, the utilities bread and butter traditionally has been we build transmission, we build generation, we mark it up, and then we pass on the costs to customers. If customers are generating the electricity, that may make some of the utility assets that still need to be paid down somewhat obsolete. And so there's a kind of a misalignment, but I would encourage you to check out on our energy markets and policy website. We have a utility business models research area, and there's a bunch of papers about emerging business models where you can get more DERs and also be kind of in line with how the utilities financial system works.
Uh, Thank you. That's great. There was another question about the fact that the grid is fragmented and there's like multiple entities that may have to invest money in the upgrade of different assets. Can you speak in the last like 2 or 3 minutes on who are the main actors there and who's kind of who needs to be included in the discussion to make this happen?
Yeah, I mean, at the highest level, there are essentially three grids in the US. There's the Eastern interconnection. You can kind of think of it like the Mississippi East. There's the Western interconnection, which is kind of shown here. I guess Eastern interconnection is a little further west in the Mississippi, and then you've got the Western interconnection, which is shown here, and then there's Texas, which is ERCOT, which is kind of its own thing. So there, at the highest level, there is fragmentation. That does not to say that there isn't some, trading and interaction that happens between these different interconnections, these three. So that's the big thing. When we're talking about making major investments in reliability and resilience, the players involved in those types of decisions are the following: utilities, okay? Consumer advocates. So utilities want to make investments. Consumer advocates definitely want reliable power, but they also don't want to pay exorbitant amounts to have perfectly reliable power. And so there's a little bit of a contentious dynamic there where you have consumer advocates who want reliability but low costs. Utilities want to make investments in reliability and resilience, but they're constrained by the cost that customers would be willing to pay. So those are two of the big players. There are certainly the regulators. These are the folks, regulators and policymakers. These are folks in a state that make decisions about rates, electricity rates, and the investments in the system. They listen to the consumer advocates, they listen to the utilities, and they make a decision based on what they think is best for society. Other players involve local, state, and federal agencies. So let's say that Commonwealth Edison has a 2-week power interruption and Chicago is without power for 2 weeks. That has implications that go way beyond Chicago, way beyond Commonwealth Edison. And so you may need to involve taxpayers to make investments. And so the way we kind of think about it is the entities that are responsible for covering investments and reliability is some mix of ratepayers, the people that benefit the most, but also taxpayers, which may extend beyond the service territory that's impacted. Having Chicago with power is a benefit to Michigan, Washington, D.C., and so there's an argument to be made that taxpayers may need to help contribute to make Commonwealth Edison, for example, a more reliable and resilient system. So those are some of the big players. There are certainly others like environmental advocacy organizations, and other stakeholders, but the big players are ratepayers, taxpayers, regulators, consumer advocates, and utilities.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Pete. I think this is the conclusion of the talk. We'll see you in the next talk. Thanks, Pete, again, and have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.